Order. Sarah Smith to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I beg to move that this House has considered children and armed conflict. It is a privilege to bring this topic to Westminster Hall today, as I know it is an important one for many of my constituents in Hyndburn. I open this debate with an uncomfortable statistic. Today, 1 in 5 children are growing up in conflict zones across the world. I am sure we can all agree that this is not a statistic we should accept nor we should ever ignore. From Gaza to Ukraine to Yemen, children are paying the highest price for conflicts they did nothing to create. Between 2020 and 2024, nearly 50,000 children have become casualties of war, the equivalent of 200 full passenger planes. And these figures are just the tip of the iceberg of the true scale of violations, limited to those incidents it was possible to record and verify, which can be extremely challenging in situations of active conflict and where access restrictions are in place. UNICEF reports that more than 100 children have been killed in Gaza alone since the ceasefire in early October 2025, an average of 1 child killed every day, and this during a ceasefire. I would like to ask the Minister if he is considering children's distinct needs and vulnerabilities and additional rights under international law in the context of assessing Israel's compliance with international human rights law. The United Nations Children and Armed Conflict Agenda makes what has been documented abundantly clear. The very youngest victims of war are being caught in its merciless machinery. Children face indiscriminate harm, including killings, maiming, recruitment, abductions and attacks on schools and hospitals, at levels not previously seen, and Gaza figures among the worst affected contexts. Currently, the occupied Palestinian territory is the most dangerous place on earth to be a child. For the 2nd year running, the occupied Palestinian territory has obtained this title, with grave violations committed at an extraordinary scale and pace by the Israeli forces. Most verified incidents were killing and maiming of children caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And it must be noted that children are 7 times more likely to die from blast injuries than adults. Concurrently, we are witnessing the destruction of spaces dedicated to children's education, development and play. Armed conflict exacts its heaviest toll on children. I will, thank you.
I congratulate her on bringing this really important debate. And she's just mentioned education, but does she agree with me that education for children in these very difficult settings can actually provide them with a lifeline in a place where they can feel safe, make friends, build up their self-confidence and self-esteem, and at the same time give them a sense of hope and aspiration for the future? And for these reasons, does she agree with me that it's very important that the government continues to fund education in these settings, and also education research into what works best in trying to help and educate our children in these very, very difficult conflict zones?
Thank you. She raises an incredibly important point, and absolutely children deserve the right to continue to have even the tiniest opportunity for some form of normality, something that helps them to imagine a world beyond the conflict that they might currently be living in. And you know, I look forward to hearing from the Minister later in terms of how our government are supporting children in conflict zones, including in Gaza. And we have to be clear that this is not simply collateral damage. With schools, hospitals and residential neighbourhoods struck, children are not just incidental casualties, they are front and centre in the decimation of armed conflict. Their places of safety, education and play are being mercilessly destroyed. These children are forced to grow up as they are faced with the daily nightmares of armed conflict and the impact that it has on their homes. Over 60% of child casualties in recent conflicts derive from explosive weapons, and the occupied Palestinian territory, including Gaza, is among the deadliest. We must also remember the long shadow that these injuries cast. A wounded child today becomes a young adult tomorrow, scarred physically, emotionally and psychologically. Many face a lifetime without adequate rehabilitation, prosthetics or even basic medical care because restricted humanitarian access and damage to hospitals make proper treatment nearly impossible.
Honourable friend, give way.
Absolutely, I will give way.
I'm grateful to her for giving way, and she's making an excellent speech on such an important topic. And I think this point she makes about the trauma of living in a war zone, a child living in a war zone, is absolutely vital. 100% of children in Gaza now, according to UNICEF, are facing mental health challenges and in need of mental health and that psychosocial support. So does she agree that that has to be a crucial part of children's protection during conflict and recovery from conflict?
Absolutely, and I recognise my honourable friend's expertise and work in this area prior to coming to this place. It is unfortunately probably no surprise to hear that statistic, given the situation that children face currently in Gaza. This Parliament has repeatedly affirmed that human rights are universal, that the rights of the child are not suspended at borders or battle lines, and that international law must be upheld consistently and without double standards. The Convention on the Rights of the Child obliges us to protect children from all forms of violence, including during armed conflict. Yet in Gaza, obligations are being flouted with impunity. The United Nations continues to verify grave violations and keep parties who violate children's rights on its monitoring list, a solemn reminder that we cannot look away. So I ask the Minister whether the government will push Israel to agree to and implement a UN action plan to reduce harm to children and ensure they remain listed in the report until they have fully achieved this. And I do want to commend the work of this Labour government, whose latest figures show they have provided £241 million in total official development assistance funding to the occupied Palestinian territories, including £154 million in humanitarian funding between 2023 and 2025. This has enabled over 500,000 medical consultations, food for about 647,000 people, and sanitation for another 300,000 people. I also pay genuine tribute to the important work that my honourable friend does and for his dedication to the region, both before coming to this place and since he's taken on these responsibilities, and his huge diplomatic efforts since the horrific and unforgivable events of October the 7th. As I conclude, it is important to return to the United Nations Children in Armed Conflict agenda, which I know the government champions and has committed additional funding to support its mandate. Their yearly report identifies the 5 most dangerous places to be a child in the world: the occupied Palestinian territory, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, Haiti, and Nigeria. This is an important tool to act as a catalyst for behaviour change. I absolutely will give way to my...
Thank you for the members securing this important debate. But would my friend agree with me that children are often used as tools and even child soldiers in many areas of conflict? For example, in Sudan, if you look at the conflict between the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, over 10 million children have been affected, 200 of which have been raped. What we need to do is make sure that wherever possible, and we need to hold accountable the governments where we can, whether it is in India, hitting deliberately, targeting children in Kashmir, whether it's Yemen, whether it's in Sudan, or whether it is in Gaza. Right? We cannot allow these situations to go on where children become the biggest sufferers. In my own constituency, I see many young men from Afghanistan with mental health issues that often I hear seeking for asylum or refugees, and we need to be giving them the help that they deserve and most need.
Can I remind honourable members this is going to be a tight debate in terms of time. Interventions should be short and to the point. Sarah Smith.
Thank you, and I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. Unfortunately, no doubt the official numbers probably don't represent the full situation, and yet they are devastating to hear what he just spoke of. Perhaps his intervention also points to a broader challenge that is not within today's debate, which is about the need in this current time for the international and global human rights order and the importance of organisations like the ICC and the UN in upholding and campaigning on these critical issues. But what matters now is whether we act on what the research from the UN's Children and Armed Conflict agenda makes unmistakably clear. Childhoods are being destroyed and places of learning, safety and sanctuary are being decimated. And we need to uphold international law and be a country, of course, that's promoting peace. It is welcome that Gaza's key Rafah border crossing is being gradually reopened. According to local hospitals and the WHO, around 20,000 sick and wounded Palestinians are waiting to leave Gaza for treatment. So can the Minister inform parliamentarians of what discussions have taken place with the Israeli government on the process for the evacuation of all severely sick children now the Rafah crossing is beginning to open? And does this allow for humanitarian, medical specialists, UN agencies and civil society organisations to support them to gain access to the occupied Palestinian territories and to support the unobstructed monitoring and reporting of grave violations against children? Thank you.
I intend to call the front bench spokespeople at 5:10. We've just got under 30 minutes and there are 7 people standing, so I think 3 minutes would be appropriate in interventions, or 3:30. Yeah, well, 3:30, but try and keep interventions brief. And can I remind members to keep bobbing before I call somebody? The question is that the House has considered children an armed conflict. Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And can I start by thanking the member for Hinburn for securing this important debate. There is no period of greater importance than childhood. Every child deserves dignity, protection, and the support needed to give them the best possible start in life. And yet today, more than 500 million children are living in active conflict zones around the world. Every day we are confronted with the human cost of war for children. The 20,000 Ukrainian children abducted and taken to Belarus and Russia, many of whom may never see their families again. The 10.8 million children in Yemen denied food, clean water, healthcare and education. And the millions of girls in Sudan facing displacement, starvation and the constant threat of abduction, exploitation and enslavement. The scale of trauma being inflicted on children worldwide is both incomprehensible and intolerable. Ending this suffering requires 2 things from government like ours: adequate humanitarian and development assistance to meet children's immediate needs, and the political courage to prioritise human rights and the prevention of harm over political expediency. On both counts, unfortunately, Chair, this government, in my view, has failed. At a time when children's suffering has never been more widespread, the government chose to halve the overseas aid budget. This was not an unavoidable necessity, but a political choice, one that has stripped millions of children of access to food, healthcare, education and protection. Now is not the time for retreat, it's a time for leadership. Instead, the government has turned away from its responsibility to uphold the most basic human dignities. But this failure goes beyond aid. The government has also failed to take the political action necessary to prevent and halt the conflicts that devastate children's lives in the first place. Nowhere is this more evident than in Gaza. For over a year, this Labour government stood by as Palestinian children were bombed, shot and starved, as their schools, hospitals and homes were destroyed. Through its inaction, the government has been complicit in the destruction of the conditions children need to live, learn and grow. It stood by as their lives were reduced to bare survival or taken away altogether. We cannot soften the reality of physical, emotional and psychological trauma inflicted on these children. A recent study led by the University of Cambridge found that constant bombardment and starvation have left children in Gaza too weak to learn or play and convinced they will be killed for being Gazans. These children have lost not only their homes and health, but their hope and their faith that the international system will protect them. Children in Gaza will have lost the equivalent of 5 years of education since 2020. Rebuilding education across Palestine is going to cost billions. As a result, these children will depend on foreign aid for decades, not because this was inevitable, but because this government failed to stand up for international law when it mattered most. We must be honest about our role in this devastation. The suffering did not occur in a vacuum, and our silence and inaction were not neutral. Lives were destroyed because it was politically convenient to look away. Thank you, Chair.
Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member Highburn for securing such an important debate. The effects of war on children are devastating. It's often seen in the media, but we must often look beyond what we see. We see humanitarian disasters. We do not see the recruitment of child soldiers beforehand, the mental trauma and the loss of education. And what we do see, we must take seriously. It is real and reflects a sad reality that many children live in, and it should never be overlooked. That is why the government must invest in conflict prevention and peace-building strategies. We need to address root causes which make children vulnerable, such as poverty, lack of support within the community. We need to prevent humanitarian crises and lead the way in doing so. The UK humanitarian framework is committed to doing this, but I want to ask the Minister today, are there any new strategies that the government is introducing or considering? We need to act early and take precautionary and preventative measures. There needs to be investment in the way children can report grave violations and the stigma associated with them that must be addressed. So I ask the Minister to liaise with other leaders in the UK and internationally on how this can be done. In developing these strategies, we must find a way to give children a voice to express what they need, for very often they are the silent victims in all of this. I therefore ask the Minister how the government is currently giving children a voice in a safe, supported way, and whether they will liaise with charities like Save the Children, who have conducted a vast amount of research on this topic and how to improve this. The UK is already a member of the UN Security Council and has donated £450,000 to the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF's monitoring and reporting mechanism 2025. Does the government intend to increase that donation, given that in 2024, less than just 2% of global security funds went towards peace building and peacekeeping, a small sum compared to the weapons of war that are produced every day? The way to combat issues such as displacement, child soldier recruitment and denial to humanitarian aid is not to decrease spending on peace building. Only recently, The Independent stated that nearly 23 million additional deaths are expected by 2030 as a result of cuts in overseas aid. Many of these will be children who will be denied a future. And what could they provide if they were allowed to live and not live in these war zones? That is the tragedy of these cases. There needs to be more long-term investment to truly minimise the life-changing effects on a child living in armed conflict. Just because war ends, Mr. Stringer, doesn't mean that the effects do. Children are left with mental trauma, lack of support, lack of infrastructure, lack of community, and tragically, a lost education. We need to use our leadership and diplomacy to find new ways to protect children. The grave violations against them are rising, and it is imperative that our framework keeps up with that. This is not a political question, it is a moral one, and we should not be found wanting. Thank you.
A real pleasure to serve under your chairship, and a big thank you to the Honourable Lady for Hinburn for setting the scene incredibly well, and for all the work that she has done over the years on her time here, and probably before she came here as well in relation to this. The Honourable Lady has championed the protection of children in armed conflict in the past and has done well to set the scene of the day. We must confront, I believe, a deeply troubling reality. Children are not only being drawn into armed conflict, they are increasingly becoming its direct victims. According to the United Nations 2023 report on the recruitment and use of child soldiers, tens of thousands of boys and girls worldwide, some as young as 8 and 9, are recruited and exploited by armed forces and armed groups with roles ranging from combatants to cooks to spies to messengers, and most disturbingly, victims of sexual slavery. Of growing concern is the use of children to carry out or plant explosive devices, reflecting the brutal evolution of modern warfare. As conflict continues to escalate across the globe, we must ask ourselves what more we can do what more government can do to protect children from lives no child should ever be forced to endure. Absolutely, yes.
John speaks from experience himself, knowing conflict, and he knows now Belfast is a vibrant European city with education on the rise. I was just wondering if he could give some advice in what can be done to address children who grew up in that conflict and how they have adapted to modern life.
I suppose from a personal experience, I was talking to the Liberal Democrats and Northern Ireland spokesperson last night, and he asked me a question very similar to that. I think we have the urban and we have the rural. If you're in the urban of Belfast, London, Derry, and the big cities, perhaps the influence upon those is more direct and harder to get away from. If you're living in the smaller towns like I've lived in, or villages I've lived in, you don't have the same direct influences. But government collectively is trying to work together to ensure that we can deliver a better life, and some of those things are Catholics and Protestants playing together, going to school together, being involved in playing football and other games together. There's lots of things that have been done. I think there's more to do, but and we all have to influence in that as well. And there's a role for churches to play as well. So thank you for that intervention, as always. I want to draw the House's attention to one particularly harrowing context: Nigeria. Boko Haram's sustained campaign of violence, particularly against religious minorities, has devastated countless lives. Children have been forcibly recruited into armed groups, while many more have lost parents, families, access to education, and even their own childhoods. Some girls have born children while still children themselves, as a direct result of captivity and abuse. In 2024, our Secretariat, the Freedom of Religious Belief Foundation that I chair, had the privilege of leading a parliamentary delegation to Nigeria. Alongside fellow members of this House and Judy Jones, the Director of the APPG on Freedom of Religion or Belief, we worked with the Gideon Paramalan Foundation, met women and girls who had survived Boko Haram captivity. The Gideon Paramalan continues to work tirelessly to secure the release of those still held by the group, often at great personal risk. And one of those children is wee Leah Sharbu. I pray for that wee girl every day. Leah is now in her 8th year of captivity, having been the only student not released following the abduction of 110 Dapchi school children by Boko Haram on the 19th of February 2018. During... yes, okay, yeah.
Does he share my concern that kidnap is increasingly used as a tool of war in areas of conflict, whether it's Ukraine, where we've seen thousands of children abducted, torn from their homes, or in Nigeria or Sudan? This is becoming more prevalent, and it's causing immense worry.
I thank the Honourable for that intervention. She's absolutely right. And whether it be in Ukraine, where there's some 30,000 children who have been kidnapped, taken away from your parents, that cut off between parents and child is incredibly devastating. And Nigeria in particular, young Leah has given birth to 3 children. Her freedom and the freedom of many like her remains unresolved. Too often children affected by armed conflict are forgotten once headlines fade, yet their suffering doesn't end when the world looks away. I'm therefore grateful that we can use our voices as members of this House in this debate today, and indeed in every debate and on the global stage, to advocate for the protection of these children and to press for accountability, for rehabilitation and long-term peace for them. I'm proud, I say honestly, to the Minister and to the Government, to support a government that recognises that every child, wherever they're born, has the right to grow up in a safe, healthy and protective environment. And I think we should be encouraged by a government that states that and says that. And finally, to those children, Mr Chairman, who in the face of relentless adversity continue to hope for a better future. And I always like to learn or end, if I can, Mr Chairman, with a scripture text. It's John 16 verse 33. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Thank you.
Sister Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's also a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I thank my honourable friend for securing the debate today. I know how interested she is and how much she cares about these issues, so it's good that we have this debate today. I make no apologies, Mr Stringer, for enumerating a number of figures that I think we would all do well to remember. As we've heard, for the second year running, the occupied Palestinian territory was the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. In 2024, Israeli armed forces were responsible for 7,188 grave violations against Palestinian children. This means that Israeli forces were responsible for more than 1 in 5 of the total number of verified grave violations committed globally in 2024. And the verified number of Palestinian children killed and maimed by Israeli forces in 2024 was 3,867. Most instances were caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And as of July 2025, over 40,500 children in Gaza were estimated to have been injured. The occupied Palestinian territory is now home, shamefully, to the largest cohort of child amputees in modern history. As of July 2025, at least 21,000 children were living with permanent disabilities, which included traumatic brain injuries, burns, complex fractures and hearing loss. A Save the Children report, Children and Blast Injuries, explains that the reason for this is often because children are uniquely vulnerable to blast injuries because they're more likely to die as a result of attacks or to suffer more severe physical harm in comparison to adults. And the situation is compounded by the rise of new weapons technologies, such as cluster munitions, and the increase of conflict being conducted in cities, with bombs and drones often striking, in fact targeting, schools, hospitals and homes. The report makes a number of calls on the government, one of which is to publish what would be the first ever cross-departmental children in conflict strategy, and I hope that's something the Minister might address in his winding up. I was very pleased that the Honourable Member for Maidstone and Weald mentioned the issue of education in conflict zones. This is an issue that former Prime Minister Gordon Brown raised a number of years ago when he said that those living in conflict zones have the right to expect medical care, but the children in conflict zones should have the right to expect to have an education, in spite of what's going on around about them, no matter how difficult that might be. We all have a view, I'm sure, about the Board of Peace that's been created to look after Palestine, look after Gaza. And I have a concern about that. I have many concerns about it, but I want to talk about one today. And that is the fact that there is only one woman on the Board of Peace. Now, I don't for a moment suggest that men don't care about children, but I do think that women have a particular perspective, and women are the people who are often now being left with the children with no support to look after them, and often having lost their breadwinner. And it seems to me that that's one area where perhaps the government could use any influence it has to advocate for more women being involved.
Brian Leishman.
Good afternoon, Mr Stringer. It is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair today, and my thanks go to my honourable friend from Hyndburn for bringing this debate to Westminster Hall. For me, the most depressing and terrifying set of departmental questions we have in this place is defence. We had a session on Monday this week and it was no exception. It always seems to be questions from nearly every corner of the chamber about increasing military spending. More money for more bombs, more weapons. Let's make Britain a defensive industrial powerhouse. And respectfully, if anyone thinks that the route to improving living standards for millions of people in this country is making drones and weapons and the like, then I'm confident that they are wrong. And when you watch the news and you see what's happening in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Syria and other places across the globe, do you think that what the world needs right now is more killing, more death, more weapons? Because I don't. I categorically think that we need less. Because when we watch the news and we see children in war zones sitting in amongst rubble, traumatised, starving, orphaned, the victims of the horrors of war, then I feel overwhelming sadness. But should we not also think about the weapons that have been used to create this appalling humanitarian situation? Specifically, in relation to Gaza, we have seen parents carry the bodies of dead children. There have been doctors come to Westminster and tell MPs about tending to children that have been shot in the head by Israeli drones. Millions of people have taken to the streets all across Britain protesting at the deaths of innocent civilians. Save the Children, not a fringe organisation, Save the Children, say that more than 20,000 children have been murdered. On average, one Palestinian child killed every hour by Israeli forces in nearly 23 months of war. Over 1,000 children under the age of 1 dead. At least 42,000 children injured, 21,000 children left permanently disabled. And during so many urgent questions and statements in the main chamber, foreign secretaries have said how arms sales are a complicated issue. But thousands of children being massacred is not complicated. I will do.
I thank the member for giving way. Does he agree with me that this government should seize all arms sales to Israel, given that the IDF general was on record, Ahran Haliva, as saying 50 Palestinians got to die for every death that happened on the 7th of October, and it doesn't matter if they're children. Probably.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I'm in complete agreement. I've said that many times in Westminster Hall and in the main chamber and in media as well. He's absolutely correct on that point. There is no justification for arms sales to Israel. And it's important that we talk about that because in the wider scheme of this, history will absolutely judge politicians in this place. Politicians will be judged on their complicity in this genocide by continuing those arms sales to Israel. Keeping global supply pools and chains stocked is not any justification for killing children and other innocents. And a ceasefire, when it is a ceasefire in name only, is no cause for celebration because the killing has continued. This week alone, Israeli airstrikes killed at least 32 Palestinians, including several children. The truth is, and we must get our head round the truth, because it's so important, the truth is that the genocide has not stopped.
Mr Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, not least as a neighbouring colleague. And I thank the member for Hyndburn for bringing this valuable debate here today. In Gaza, aid workers and medical teams have become used to using the world's most heartbreaking acronym, WCNSF. Wounded child, no surviving family. The phrase was born in Gaza's hospitals as overworked trauma surgeons had to deal with so many injured, unaccompanied children that they simply scrawled WCNSF on their files. As Kieran King, the humanitarian head of the UK charity Wall Child, told us at a briefing in Parliament last month, Gaza is the first conflict where such a term has been needed because of the sheer numbers of wounded children. The UN's Child Protection Agency, UNICEF, cited Gaza Health Ministry statistics last September, recording 2,596 children had lost both parents, and a further 53,000 had lost at least one parent. These figures mean that 47,000 Palestinian children will grow up with no father, and 5,920 will grow up with no mother. And these are not just ordinary statistics. Gaza has the highest rate of child amputations of any modern conflict. These are all individual human beings whose stories need to be shared. The powerful new film, The Voice of Hind Rajab, which was screened to many of us MPs in Parliament last month, bears witness to one of those stories, following the Red Crescent response during the killing of a 6-year-old Palestinian girl by the IDF. Those of us who saw that film will never forget it. So I was proud that this government, working with Labour MPs, within days of the Gaza ceasefire, brought over 50 children to the NHS to be treated for their complex injuries. But there's much, much more we can do to rebuild the healthcare, the schools, the social services that children desperately need in Palestine. But the other and often forgotten conflict that involves children is, of course, in Sudan. As a civil war rages between Sudan's army and the RSF rebels, and it's now in its third year, the scale of suffering is enormous. In 2026, a staggering 17 million children are expected to need urgent aid. More than 5 million children have been forced from their homes, the equivalent of 5,000 children displaced every single day, many of them repeatedly with attacks and sexual violence that often follows them as they move. Only yesterday, 5 more children were killed in another drone strike by the paramilitary RSF on a health centre in the city of Kadugli. And UNICEF has been clear, children in Sudan are not statistics. They're frightened, they're displaced, they're hungry. But they're also determined, resourceful and resilient. And every day, they, like the children of Gaza, strive to learn, they strive to play, they strive to hope. Ending the child suffering in both countries is a moral necessity through all the powers we have over diplomacy, aid and trade. And those responsible for that suffering should be made accountable under international law. The reckoning will come. It may not be this year, but it will come one day.
Christine Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. And I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Hyndburn, for securing this debate. And I also pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire South, for her campaigning to return the stolen Ukrainian children. Worryingly, children are increasingly the deliberate targets of violence and the severe disaster unfolding in Sudan. The UN General Secretary's Children and Armed Conflict Mandate has documented a severe escalation in grave violations against children. Most of all, the RSF, who control most of southwest Sudan, have nearly 1,200 attributed violations against children in the past year. These violations kill and maim children every single day. Sexual violence, abductions and recruitment are a routine weapon of war. These are not sporadic acts, but a systematic campaign of terror against children. Forces in Sudan are using hunger and sexual violence as a weapon to target entire ethnic communities. UNICEF and local NGOs have reported widespread sexual violence against women and girls, against children as young as 1 year old, a baby. And the children of Sudan will carry the physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. As they rebuild and reconcile, they will need unprecedented support to overcome injuries, including those who have lost limbs, traumatic stress, and the collapse of their entire world as they knew it. I believe we have an obligation to support the Sudanese people, a human obligation, but also to account for our long and complicated relations with Sudan. I was contacted by one constituent concerned that British-made military components could be diverted to the RSF, and given the RSF's atrocities, I want the government to resolve that any diversion of military components would be morally indefensible. And I'm grateful for the Minister's recent response to my letter on this point. He confirmed that officials have reviewed over 2,000 licences, considering the allegations of diversion, stating there are no current licences for the reported equipment and none issued to the UAE in recent years. But I would be grateful if the Minister can reiterate that assurance today, because vigilance is essential. We cannot stop. Our commitment to prevent British-made components from fuelling atrocities must be absolute, and we must act with urgency, transparency and determination.
Monica Harding, on behalf of the Lib Dems.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Stringer, and I thank the honourable member from Hyndburn for bringing this vital debate to the House today. Today, as we have heard, 1 in 5 children live in areas affected by armed conflict, displacement or related violence. These are children who face a daily threat to their lives, their health and their education. Children forced to flee their homes, pulled out of classrooms, separated from parents and exposed to violence that no adult shall have to endure, let alone a child. And the damage does not end when the fighting pauses. Trauma, lost education and broken health systems follow children for decades. And while Britain has a proud history of leadership in this space, saving millions of children's lives through vaccinations, nutrition, clean water and frontline healthcare, and supporting UN monitoring and reporting for accountability, and funding programmes that have helped secure the release and reintegration of child soldiers, but at a time when armed conflicts are at their highest since the end of the Second World War, the UK is choosing to look away, cutting aid to its lowest level this century, with devastating consequences for children. Let me say something briefly about the conflicts that are bringing this issue into sharp focus. In Ukraine, children are growing up under constant missile and drone attacks from Russia. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian children may have been abducted and taken into Russia or Russian-controlled areas without consent and under coercive conditions. In Gaza, the impact on children has been devastating, as we have heard. Hospitals and schools, places that should be sanctuaries, have been systematically and repeatedly struck. And I will never forget the testimony given to the International Development Committee, of which I serve, by a doctor working at a Gaza hospital on the children that were targeted by drone attacks. Save the Children have estimated that more than 20,000 children have been killed in Gaza. That is one every hour in 2 years of war. Of those still alive in Gaza, UNICEF tells us that there is a ton of emptiness and deep sorrow that you can see in the children there. 39,000 children have been orphaned and 17,000 are unaccompanied. And these children are playing in areas at risk of explosive ordinances, at high risk of injury and death, and leading to high rates of disability. Many have had hands and legs amputated. And these children are suffering from hunger, from disease, displacement and cold. 8 infants dying of hypothermia this winter alone, and more than 100 children killed since the ceasefire. Some need urgent medical evacuation that simply isn't happening at scale, while others are growing up with trauma that will shape the rest of their lives. And as Israel moves to tighten, in some case end, INGO registration, it has put dozens of organisations at risk of being forced to halt life-saving operations across the Gaza Strip and West Bank. And the Lifeline Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, which operates more than 700 schools, has had its ability to function curtailed. And in Sudan, what is unfolding is one of the world's most severe and tragically overlooked crises affecting children. In the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, UNICEF has warned that nearly 500,000 children are now at risk of acute malnutrition as the conflict intensifies, a stark reminder that for many children in Sudan, survival itself is becoming increasingly uncertain. And checkpoints are armed by boys, teenagers, while girls risk endemic sexual violence. The United Nations continues to verify thousands of cases each year of children being recruited and used by armed groups, a grave violation of international law. Children are deployed not only as fighters, but also as guards, scouts, messengers, exposing them to extreme danger and lifelong trauma. In camps in North Darfur, Sudan, survivors describe how RSF fighters killed parents and abducted children as young as 9, blindfolding them and driving them away. Some told they would look after livestock, a euphemism for enslavement. The persistence of child recruitment across multiple conflicts reflects the collapse of protection, education and accountability, and preventing it must remain a central test of the international community's commitment and our commitment in the UK to the laws of war. Across all these contexts, the pattern is the same. Children are not a sideshow of war. They are among its primary victims. And that is why the government must commit to treating the protection of children not as a secondary concern, but as a central pillar of its foreign policy. First, our diplomacy must put children at the heart of peace efforts. The safety of children, their access to schools and hospitals, and the reunification of families must be built into peace processes from the beginning. Britain has both the responsibility and the leverage to lead as a major international actor and as the penholder at the UN Security Council. Second, our humanitarian response must go beyond survival alone. Education must be protected. Schools must be treated as humanitarian spaces in a conflict zone. Mental health support for children affected by conflict should be core funding. A child who survives war but is left traumatised, uneducated and unsupported is still a casualty of conflict, and if we ignore that trauma, we shouldn't be surprised by the consequences. Entire generations growing up with grief, anger and abandonment become a fertile ground for radicalisation, many ending up in terrorist groups like Hamas. Third, accountability matters. We must make every effort to ensure that crimes are recorded, that journalists are allowed into conflict zones, and that we call out breaches of international humanitarian law wherever they occur. And this must apply to allies and adversaries alike, because selective outrage weakens international law. We must name violations consistently, support independent investigations and back consequences when the law is ignored. And finally,
thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Hindberg for securing this important debate. I also thank colleagues from across the Chamber or the House for their thoughtful contributions and interventions, not least my honourable friend, the member for Maidstone and Malling, not in her place now, but who did serve as Special Envoy for Girls' Education during the last government, and I thank her for that. Children are not incidental victims of war. Increasingly, they are its deliberate targets, whether through forced deportation, indoctrination, recruitment into armed groups, or the destruction of schools and healthcare. Children are being used as instruments of conflict, and that should shame us all. It should compel action. I want to start with Ukraine, where the abuse of children has been systematic and calculated. Thousands of Ukrainian children, some estimates put that figure at over 20,000, have been forcefully taken from their families and deported into Russia or Russian-occupied territory. Some were taken from orphanages, others were removed from parents at gunpoint. Many are subjected to so-called re-education, stripped of their identity, their language and their nationality. And behind every statistic is a child, a family torn apart and a future placed deliberately out of reach. The UK has rightly condemned these crimes, but condemnation alone is not enough. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what practical steps is the UK taking to support efforts to identify, track and return abducted Ukrainian children? Through which international partners is the government principally working? And also, what progress has been made on sanctions enforcement against the individuals and entities responsible for these deportations? We know that evidence exists, so what is holding up further designations? Finally, on Ukraine, will the Minister update the House on how the UK is supporting international accountability mechanisms, including the ICC, to ensure that those who have committed crimes against children are brought to justice, not in theory, but in practice? I'd like to now turn to the Middle East, an issue that does require care, seriousness and balance. Israel faces a real and ongoing security threat from Hamas, a terrorist organisation that cynically embeds itself among civilians and has itself committed grave abuses against children, including hostage-taking and indoctrination. At the same time, children in Gaza have suffered enormously. Many have lost family members, homes and access to education. If we are serious about breaking cycles of conflict, we must look beyond the immediate crisis and also look to what comes next. I want to touch on reconstruction and education. Schools are not just buildings, they're foundations of stability and of hope. So what is the UK doing to press for the rebuilding of schools in Gaza once the conditions allow? Which organisations and mechanisms is the government principally working through? And how is it ensuring that planning for education recovery is happening now rather than left to being an afterthought? Education must never be a vehicle for hatred. There have been long serious concerns about elements of the Palestinian curriculum that risk inciting violence or glorifying extremism. UK taxpayers rightly expect that our aid does not entrench these problems. So I ask the Minister directly today, what pressure is the UK applying to the Palestinian Authority to secure root and branch curriculum reform? What specific benchmarks are being used? And what evidence is there, if any, of meaningful progress to date? And how are UK-funded education programmes monitored to ensure they promote peace, tolerance and coexistence? I'd like to turn also to Sudan, a crisis that all too often slips from the headlines, but which represents one of the gravest humanitarian catastrophes in the world today, particularly for children. Children in Sudan are being killed, displaced, recruited by armed groups and denied access to basic healthcare and education. Girls we know face heightened risks of sexual violence, and entire communities have been uprooted and humanitarian access remains dangerously constrained. The UK has spoken about leadership on Sudan, so I'd like to see and ask where is that leadership now and what concrete steps is the government taking to secure humanitarian access. But more broadly, across all these conflicts, children are paying the price for impunity. So I ask the Minister about the government's overall approach to children and armed conflict. How is the UK ensuring that the protection of children is embedded across its diplomatic, development and defence policy? Not siloed, not rhetorical, but operational. And finally, what assessment has the government made of the long-term consequences of failing these children? Not just for them, but for global stability. Because children denied safety, education and justice today are far more likely to inherit conflict tomorrow. Those of us in the Conservative Party have long been clear, protecting children in conflict is not optional, it is a moral duty and a strategic necessity. We in the UK have the diplomatic weight, legal expertise and moral standing to lead. Leadership requires consistency, urgency and follow-up, and I urge the government to match its words with decisive action. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Hyndburn, for securing this debate. I hope members will bear with me. A lot has been raised. I will endeavour to make some progress covering Gaza, Ukraine and Sudan, and make some general remarks about children in armed conflict before taking interventions, which I'll endeavour to do before the end of the session. We are clearly witnessing a deeply troubling trend. Not only is conflict spreading, but as many members have said, it is becoming more dangerous for children. We must, of course, keep their welfare in the spotlight as we respond to these crises. My ministerial colleague, the Member of Parliament for Bridgend, would have been glad to participate today, but he's unavoidably travelling on ministerial duties. It's therefore my pleasure to respond on behalf of the Government. I'm grateful to all of the honourable members for their contributions, and I will try to respond to them in the order that I set out. According to the United Nations Secretary-General, grave violations against children surged by 25% in 2024. Children are being killed, maimed, abducted and abused at staggering levels. This is clearly absolutely indefensible. We will keep pushing loudly and consistently to protect children wherever we can. We are focused on preventing these crimes, stopping them when they happen, and pushing armed groups to follow international law. We are a party to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we take our responsibilities seriously. We play an active role in the UN Security Council Working Group on Children and Armed Conflicts, calling out abuses and pushing for accountability. And we'll keep championing the UN Children and Armed Conflict mandate as well as UN monitoring. My honourable friend, the member for Caerphilly, pointed out that we're spending £450,000 this year on UNICEF's monitoring and reporting mechanism. That was on top of £250,000 last year. We're working to boost global efforts, and on the question of the government strategy, which was raised by many honourable members, we're looking closely at whether a dedicated children and conflict strategy is the right next step, and I can confirm to the House that that work is well underway. We are also considering how we strengthen our expertise on children and armed conflict through developing a new practical toolkit for officials. Let me turn in brief to specific conflict zones raised. I must, I'm afraid, repudiate almost everything said by the member for Perry Barr. We have been many things, but silent is not one of them. We have not looked away. We have taken tangible action in relation to the crisis in Gaza from the very moment I became a minister and we became the government. I have seen for myself the horrific impact of this conflict in children in Gaza. I have seen it in the region. I have seen it on the faces of the children that I am so proud that we've been able to assist here in the UK. I was asked an important question by one of my honourable friends about the partial opening of the Rafah crossing. That is indeed being prioritised at the moment for those most medically vulnerable. There are still small numbers crossing on foot, mostly into Egypt, though there is some two-way traffic. It is clearly absolutely vital that that crossing opens to the scale that it operated in before June of 2024. And we need to see all of the crossings opened So the medical assistance and indeed the vital reconstruction materials are in place to provide children in Gaza the support that they need. But we cannot shy away from the scale of devastation in Gaza. Our assessment is that since October 2023, at least 20,000 children have been killed, and that does include 100 children since the ceasefire was announced nearly 4 months ago. As the Honourable Member for Rochdale, indeed my friend, has pointed out, thousands more are now living with life-changing injuries. It is a grim statistic that Gaza now has more child amputees than anywhere in the world. Unexploded ordnance will continue to threaten lives even after the ceasefire, and it prevents access to humanitarian assistance. That's why the Foreign Secretary has announced £4 million for the UN Mine Action Service in Gaza. We're providing £81 million in humanitarian early recovery support for Palestine as part of a £116 million package, but clearly these questions of access, which so many honourable members touched on, are absolutely vital. Around 10 million of that will go straight to UNICEF for infant formula, for clean water, sanitation, mental health support and assistance for families. To date, UK Med teams have supported more than 950,000 patients with consultations. We've provided nearly £30 million to UNRWA to try and keep education and healthcare moving. I won't provide too much commentary on the status of UNRWA, but I want to recognise the points that the opposition spokesperson has made about questions of the education curriculum, questions on which we are engaged, we discuss with UNRWA and indeed with the Palestinian Authority. I want to address too the deeply concerning reports of mistreatment of Palestinian children in detention. We continue to raise this repeatedly with Israel. Due process must be followed when children are detained, in line with international justice standards, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, who have extensive experience of these issues, must have full access to all detention facilities. Turning to Sudan, the crisis in Sudan, as so many honourable members have rightly pointed out, is destroying the lives of children. We are showing the UK leadership that the Conservative spokesperson asked for. This morning, after visiting the Chad-Sudan border, the Foreign Secretary has announced a further £20 million in new support for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and for women and girls facing violence. Our humanitarian support should help more than 2.5 million people to get access to food, clean water, medicine and shelter. UNICEF have grimly assessed that nearly 90% of Sudan's school-aged children are no longer in school due to the conflict. 200,000 children in Sudan and neighbouring countries have received help to stay in school, but knowing the region as I do, I know the extent of trauma that those children will be suffering. Turning to Ukraine, Russia's illegal invasion has clearly unleashed some of the most shocking abuses that we've seen. Reports show around 20,000 Ukrainian children have been forcibly taken to Russia or Russian-controlled territory. Another 1.7 million children live under occupation, and many are being subject to efforts to erase their identity. The Shadow Foreign Office spokesperson asks about who our primary partners are. We've committed nearly £3 million to help Ukraine return these children home and support their recovery. Our primary partner is the Ukrainian government, but we work internationally with our partners, and the Minister for Europe is chairing such a meeting this afternoon to ensure continued attention to these issues. I want to touch briefly on wider issues, including, as my honourable friend, the member for Rochdale. No, I'll come to Nigeria in a second. My honourable friend, the member for Rochdale, has touched on the importance of explosive weapons and demining, particularly as they relate to children. I want to be clear that we stand firmly behind the agreements that reduce these threats. That's the Mines Ban Treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. We also back the EWIPA Declaration and the Safe Schools Declaration. We are funding demining and education on the risks of explosives in 12 countries, including Ukraine, Palestine and Sudan. We have helped clear, since 2024, 26 million square metres of land, helping make life safer for more than 94,000 children. Where we can, including in Nigeria, we seek to help children injured by war to ensure that that aid reaches all children affected by conflict across lines, including in Nigeria and the conflicts that I have referenced. I want to again thank my honourable friend, the member for Hinburn, once again for bringing us together for this debate. I know the degree of her personal commitment to these issues, and indeed my other colleagues on the Labour benches who have worked on them both in this place and in their previous lives. This work could not matter more. We'll continue to push for action to protect children caught up in war zones, because no child should have their young life wrecked by conflict. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered children and armed conflict. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is adjourned.